Okay, so I can just start with a very quick welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the very first inaugural session of the Tough Questions webinar series. This is hosted by the Food Security Group within the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. I just wanted to start with very few words about the motivation behind this series. We wanted to create a space for unstructured, more open-ended conversation around how we do our work in international development research and policy support, and to create space that is dedicated to conversations that are not necessarily easy. And we don't have an expectation that we will emerge from these conversations with some very crisp answers, but still to have a space that is dedicated to having somewhat difficult conversations. So I want to very much thank the moderator and the four panelists who agreed to participate in this first session. Make yourself available. For this hour, Laura Schmidt-Olabisi, the moderator, Anna Josephson, Kurt Richter, and Sarah Jansen, our three panelists today. We're very grateful. I also want to thank Austin Witt, our communications guru within the Food Security Group, for your work in putting this together. And for any audience members, I really want to encourage you to, as you're listening, to think of questions or comments to participate in the conversation yourself, so we can really make it a wider conversation. With that, I'll pass it over to Laura Schmidt-Olabisi.
Great. Thank you, Ayala. Thanks, Austin and all. And I'm really excited to be here today. I am joining you from Ibadan, Nigeria. I'm currently on the campus of the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture because I'm on sabbatical, but normally I'm a professor in the Department of Community Sustainability and the Environmental Science and Policy program at MSU, and I work with FSG also. So I'm excited to be moderating this panel. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to let them talk a little bit about how they've encountered difficult ethical challenges in their work and how that can inform the field of development. So let me start with Dr. Kurt Richter. Dr. Richter is an associate professor in our Department of Community Sustainability at MSU. He's also the director and principal investigator for the Innovation Scholars Program and the Grain Research and Innovation Programs at MSU. And he also serves as the deputy director for the Global Center for Food Systems Innovation. So he has over 25 years of experience in higher ed and international development, including a lot of experience managing USAID-funded projects. And he's worked in numerous countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and has held long-term leadership roles in Guatemala, Colombia, Afghanistan, and the Republic of Georgia, and has worked on human and institutional capacity development projects in a number of other countries. So that's Dr. Richter. Dr. Anna Josephson is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics and co-director of the AID Lab at the University of Arizona. Her research focuses on individuals and households around the world working on issues of decision-making, agriculture, and food security. And her book, together with Jeffrey Michler, I'm not sure I pronounced that right, but Research Ethics and Applied Economics, A Practical Guide. And then we have Dr. Sarah Jansen from Illinois Center for the Economics of Sustainability. And she uses economic theory and empirical approaches to study the dynamics of global poverty and sustainable international agricultural development. Her empirical research stems from the design and implementation of collaborative international impact evaluations that rigorously seek to evaluate agricultural development in Asia and Africa. And she also uses dynamic optimization and simulation. So I'll talk about that because I'm also a modeler, to analyze optimal consumption, asset accumulation, and risk management decisions of poor and vulnerable households. So welcome to all of you. I'm really excited to hear from the vast experience that clearly exists on this panel. So maybe we can just start off with a few minutes. You can talk through some of the, we're talking about ethical challenges in international development work. What are some of those challenges? How have you faced them? How do you think they're going to play out in the future? And what's important for people entering this field or working in this field to know? And Dr. Jansen, maybe we could start with you because you're to the left on my screen. That's okay.
Actually, I was hoping we would start with Anna. Anna wrote the book, the definitive book on ethics issues in the space. So I think Anna was maybe going to provide a broader overview, and then I might dive in on one of the particular issues if that's okay.
Great. Anna, go for it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to um, talk a little bit about ethics and talk about them in development in particular, as that's generally my area of work. Like Laura said, I published a book about a year ago that covers ethics really broadly. We're thinking about ethics like across the spectrum of a research idea. And while development isn't the explicit focus, I think there are a lot of ideas that intersect. So I wanted to start today by potentially highlighting three that have stood out to me as I've thought in advance of this panel. With that said, I'll add the caveat at the beginning that I'm a Western researcher at a Western research institution. I'm at a American land grant university. So all of these that I'm raising are very much from my reference point, and that's the only point that I'm comfortable speaking from. So the first thing I wanted to raise is one that I think many of us have had in our mind in one way or another this week, which is idea development, the ethical sourcing of ideas, and how we're coming to these, and especially thinking about the concept of induced innovation. And are we looking for ideas that should be researched, need to be researched, or are we looking for ideas where maybe the money happens to be? And I'm sure that all of us, many of us, some of us on this call in the past week have received stop work orders for some of our research. And I know I have been thinking about how my ideas might be changing as funding sources shift over the next indeterminate period of time. And thinking about the implications of that for my work more broadly and the implications of that for our whole field and the whole world, really. So that's one thing that I'm sure folks have lots of thoughts on. The second is something I would classify broadly as project development. And when I think about project development, I'm thinking about building a team and equitably engaging as a group of researchers. And when I talk about this in my grad class, I'm usually talking about the interactions between a grad student and his or her advisor. But in this context, talking about development, I'm really thinking about engaging with local partners, thinking about non-academic collaborators, and how you align incentives and engage meaningfully in a community. And then the last thing, which I know Sarah is going to talk about a little bit more, is data collection. And on a really base level, this is ensuring compliance with an IRB. And there's differences between Western and non-Western institutions and requirements. But I think more importantly, thinking and considering the meaningful protection of research participants and, oh, I just got bigger. Cool. And how a how a researcher thinks about the difference between ensuring compliance with their legal obligation to their potentially Western university and what it actually means to engage ethically in a community and to conduct research with people rather than on people. So those are three ideas that really rise to the fore for me right now that I'd love to chat about a little more. But perhaps now I can turn it over to Sarah or Kurt for their overview. Does one of you have a preference?
I can go. Since I already pawned it off once, I'll go now. Thank you, Anna, for that introduction. I think that's a nice little overview. So as Anna said, I thought I would focus on ethics issues related specifically to data analysis. And my plan was just to introduce a few of them, and then people can ask questions and we can drive the conversation wherever we want to go. But I'll first pick off real quick what Anna mentioned at the very end, which is something I've thought a lot about, and Anna and I think, both thought a lot about and think about. This idea of ensuring compliance with an IRB doesn't guarantee ethical engagement with other researchers. It doesn't guarantee that your research is ethical in all dimensions, right? The IRB is ensuring compliance with legal obligations. But I've heard someone say before in response to a question, well, we had IRB clearance, so clearly we're fine. And I don't think that's a comprehensive way to answer that question or think about that question. I think we have an obligation as researchers to think deeper about what it means to engage, especially in other contexts. So I think that's really important. With respect to data analysis, the main data issues that I'm thinking about are data dredging or p-hacking. These terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but the idea of running many statistical tests, but only reporting maybe the results that are significant. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this idea that the more tests you run, the more likely you are to get a significant result, which can distort the results that get presented. P-hacking, you're reanalyzing data to yield a target result. Both of these issues are exacerbated by the stars that we place in our regression tables. So your results look better if you have more stars. So these arbitrary cutoffs of 0.01 or 0.05 significance can distort research decisions in a way that calls in to play ethics and ethical questions. What does this look like practically? Let me give 2 examples. One is just trimming the data. There's nothing wrong with trimming the data, right? It's something that I do. It's really important. I train my grad students to do it. Trimming, Windsorizing, removing outliers. The issue is that the rules regarding data trimming are ill-defined, and so one might be tempted to trim certain observations based on your results. And that's where we get into these ethical issues. Another example is like choosing your variables. So if you have 5 different ways of measuring something like women's empowerment or aspirations, how do you decide which one to use? If the results are significant using one variable, but not when you use the alternative, then a researcher might be tempted to report the results using the ones that are generating these significant results, but that again calls into play why you chose that particular variable. I think both of these examples, these apply broadly speaking for researchers, but I think they're really important in development because we do so much primary data collection. It means we're responsible for data cleaning and processing decisions in a way that is just much more intense and purposeful than researchers who, take a data set off the shelf. So when you collect the data yourself, it's up to you to decide what the best way to measure something is, or if the data is in fact garbage. And that's a real challenge because it can actually be pretty easy, even if it's embarrassing, to say that our data that we collected is garbage. And it's harder to do that if you're just taking like published US Census data. You can't just say that data is garbage. So we have this freedom to like kind of judge the quality of our data, but with that freedom, I think comes a responsibility to make decisions that are ethical and not related to the results we think we want to get or statistical significance. So maybe I'll just close. There are a couple other data-related issues that you might want to think about. One of them would be harking, hypothesizing after results are known, and then presenting it as if that was your initial hypothesis. Another data analysis issue would be the file drawer problem. So this failure to publish null results. So the fact that the body of evidence that exists in terms of published research is a biased body of work because we're only publishing, or we have a tendency to publish significant findings only. Those are both issues. I guess where I wanted to close was just thinking about how do we deal with these issues. So one solution that I've implemented and even written about in a paper with Jeff Mishler, who was mentioned previously, we wrote a paper published in the AEPP in 2021 on pre-analysis plans, which has been posed as a solution for dealing with some of these data analysis ethical issues. So it's exactly what it sounds like if you're not familiar with them. You make a plan for how we will analyze the data, prior to analyzing the data. And what that does is it reduces a researcher's degrees of freedom. So it should help to minimize data dredging, p-hacking, harking, all these things, because you've sort of pre-committed yourself to what you're going to do before you see your results. In my opinion, some flexibility to deviate is needed. So even the best researchers are unlikely to get everything perfectly right in their initial plan. So the challenge here is that allowing flexibility reduces the ability of a pre-analysis plan to completely block those ethical dilemmas. There are trade-offs, basically. So you can report deviations or actually prepare a populated pre-analysis plan in which all of your planned analysis is reported. Those are doable kind of alternative solutions. They're also costly, though, so I think we have to consider that too. They're costly to prepare. That's my experience, is that it can be costly to continuously update as your research evolves. So pre-analysis plans are one solution. They have trade-offs. I think they actually have many practical benefits as well, which is something that Jeff and I wrote about in that paper. Generally, I found that meticulously planning out my data analysis before even opening data, or ideally before even collecting the data, can dramatically improve the quality and thoughtfulness of the research. And if that also translates into maybe, minimizing my own, even in my best intentions, my ability to do things that are potentially ethical, then that's good. So those are my thoughts. There are challenges. Pre-analysis plans might be some solution that we might want to think about, but it's maybe not the be-all end-all. I'll hand it over to Kurt.
Great, thanks. And Kurt, as you start, I noticed that people are already starting to pop some questions into Q&A, which is great. So continue to do that, and we'll get to those after our panel has a chance to introduce their issues. So go ahead, Kurt. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Laura. What amazing timing that we're having this conversation on ethics and international development research, given what's going on in the world of international development. So I'm going to approach this topic from an area that's not really talked a lot about in graduate school and higher education. And that is, what are the ethics around how do we actually do the work outside of the data collection? So earlier in my career, I ended up in the Republic of Georgia, not too long after they gained their independence after the collapse of the former Soviet Union. One thing that became very important to us when we were doing our work in Georgia was not necessarily while the work was important, it was important that we demonstrated how to do our work, how the work was actually done. Because how we engage with our partners, how we track expenses, how we work in getting participants to come to meetings, there's an ethical element to that. At the same time, I am unable to self-fund my research. I rely on money mainly from USAID and other donors to do my work. Behind my work are a set of regulations. And how I interpret those regulations and how my partners interpret those regulations often are very different. And I am always wondering, where do my ethical approach to managing funds and engaging with partners and working with beneficiaries, where do my ethical guidelines stop and my partner's ethical guidelines start? So I have delivered a lot of workshops. I've given out, lots of money and sub-awards to partners. And it's always amazed me that the interpretation of our regulations can have a big impact on the people who are in the room, the people who are engaged to do the work. Maybe it's, there could be, I've worked with local partners who are fabulous local partners, but it's obvious to me that they've selected participants or given out roles on my projects as carrots as incentives to build their their status and their social capital inside their organizations. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. The ethics around how we do our work, I find to be difficult. I'm always trying to watch those things, and I'm afraid for the members here to hear me talk today, I don't have any answers. I have a lot of questions, but there is ethics around how we not necessarily do the science, but how we do the implementation that allows the science to occur. And this week, we've all received stop orders that were probably unthinkable 3 months ago. But because of the regulations we are now working under, we're probably forced to do things by those regulations that ethically we would not have imagined even talking about a while ago. And so, my view on ethics and on this panel is, how do our regulations that our donors give us, and how do our ethical approaches and views of our partners shape what we're actually able to do in the field and how it gets delivered? And so we've got lots of examples we can talk about, but I want people to think about the ethics in how we do the work and be reflective on what we are showing by how we do the work as ethical work to our partners. And understanding that ethics are cultural, and there might not be a specific, simple answer to these questions. But I tell my students in my classes, it's not about getting it right, it's about getting it better. And I'm just interested in having a conversation today with this group about the ethics around how we do our work. How do we hand out money? How do we fund the work? And how do we design the work to be ethical? So back to you, Lauren.
Great, thanks, Kurt. And I like what you said, that you have questions but not answers. We actually, in community sustainability for our graduate students, ethics is one of the core competencies that we teach. And I've learned from the philosophers in our department that ethics is about wrestling with the right questions, not having a given answer. So I think that's what we're trying to do here today. So there's already some great questions in the Q&A. And again, everyone, please put your questions there and we will get to them. So I'm just going to start right off with what some of our attendees are asking. So the first question, how can we think of research in decolonial terms that center sovereignty and right to self-determination? And related to that, how can we approach ethics in terms of communities' desire to leverage development towards their own interests? Really big, complex question. I'd love to hear your answers to it.
That's a hard question. I think it's a really important question. So let's just launch onto Kurt's response that he just had, right? We don't necessarily have answers, but I guess to me, the first step is acknowledging the issue and that it's a problem. And I think the second step is in building partnerships and building true partnerships that are truly collaborative, which is hard. So even I think for those of us that are really committed to that, it can be hard. So I'd love to learn how to be better at it because it's something that I value and is really important to me. But even then, I found it to be challenging. So I'd love ideas from anyone on this one. Anna,
Yeah.
Kurt.
Yeah. I can't see anybody. I'm on my phone. My computer's not cooperating today, so I can't really see much. I'll hop on real quickly and I'll get off. Um, one time I did an exercise with a really trusted local partner. Um, and we talked about how do we truly make it something, you know, driven by the stakeholders. And what we ended up doing was we ended up developing a list of things we didn't want to do, things we didn't want to see. And that was the starting point towards crafting a new approach. At the same time, I had to keep our regulations, our policies close at hand, because simply identifying what you don't want to have happen doesn't mean all the things that you want to have happen are possible given the regulations and policies that we work under. And so that's how we did it one time. It worked for that situation, but it was with a really trusted partner who I could really have honest and frank conversations with, not only about my approach, but also their approach. So it took a while.
I think I've been thinking about this particular issue quite a bit. Insofar as I don't have an answer, and when someone does, that would be great. But I think for a long time, a lot of development work was sort of handed down. Like, here is the thing I have created for you. And even in cases where there's been a lot of success and a lot of uptake, and clearly there was demand, the kind of roots outside of community engagement have scars, I guess. And I don't know that we deal with this well in talking about it in class or engaging with it in kind of development core curriculum either. And I don't know I don't know that I have more to say than that, but this is something I've been thinking about quite a bit.
Yeah, I love, just to sum up what I'm hearing, building partnerships and co-creating research, definitely pathways to maybe in this direction. And as part of that, I wonder if economics can, and this is part of another question later, that if economics can learn from other disciplines that have maybe been doing that a bit more. I know that like disciplines like public health, for example, community development in the US, planning departments. So just something to think about.
Yeah, I think I will say I have in a few grants that I've put in recently, I put in co-creation as a component of sort of hypothesis testing and like a next step. And without fail, in every single one of the grant reviews, they have been rejected and said, take that out on resubmission. And so I don't know how to do that if I want to meaningfully engage in this research. And I think that co-creation was the right thing. I wouldn't have put it in if I didn't. And to be told that that's what has to go for a competitive resubmission is really, really hard. And I think the point to public health is a good one. I think there's a lot of good engagement there that we're lacking right now.
That is fascinating to me because I just put in a grant to NSF, which who knows what will happen to it now, but earlier this year, where co-creation with community partners was required. Like it was a required component of the grant. They would not review it if you didn't have meaningful partnership with community partners. So in some fields, they're maybe looking at this a bit more than in economics. Okay.
Can I just add to that? It feels like in many cases, this is like similar to the IRB problem where it feels like it's like check boxes though, where a lot of times, a funder might say they want that, or they might say you have to have a co-PI from the country, but they don't really mean it. They're just looking to tick boxes. And I think that is one of the most discouraging things, where just having a co-PI doesn't mean that it's meaningful engagement. So recognizing that and acknowledging that and being very purposeful about what co-creation means and what that looks like, I think is really important. I think the other thing that's a challenge here is that, as Kurt said, these things take time. And so for junior researchers, I think it's even harder to do this. I remember like the first big project that I started, and like frankly, it wasn't co-creation, but through that partnership as it evolved over time, and I started to like, trust my partners and they started to trust me more. Like we've developed some very strong relationships where, co-creation is definitely a possibility. But that takes time to build those relationships. So I think that's a challenge, is how can we facilitate that for junior researchers?
Yeah, really, really good points. Excellent. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to a next question. I would be interested in hearing about the ethical dilemmas in doing research using RCT methodology. Although we have borrowed this methodology from the field of medicine and clinical sciences, I feel that the field of development research has not fully embraced the ethical standards that are followed in medicine and clinical science. Thoughts?
So I'll confess, I've never run an RCT. I have like designed one in practice, but I have never actually run an RCT. So I can like tell the best practices, but I think maybe starting with Sarah or Kurt on this one, who I think have both run RCTs, might be better.
Yeah, I'll start real quickly. The ethical dilemmas with RCTs are real. Let's start. I'm gonna start with that. I was engaged with an RCT around food aid programs and childhood nutrition. The ethical dilemmas around that were, off the chart. And basically, I think there is no getting around it. But what we tried to do is we tried to focus on the bigger picture and understanding that, doing nothing and not learning anything from the work was not in the best interest of everybody who was engaged in all the population. And we made amends to the RCT group later on after our research was ended, that they could then engage in the food aid program in a different phase. And so I'm not going to say we got it right, but we did do it in a way that allowed us to collect our data in the RCT for a fixed period of time, and then close our research, and then open up the control community to support at a period post research. But there is no doubt that the ethics around RCT, picking who is the control group, is real, but we did it by focusing on the bigger picture and then finding a way to go back at the end. I'm not saying that is right or that should be done, but that's what we did. Over.
Sure, I can join that question. I agree. I think it's something that's really important for us to think about as researchers who are implementing RCTs. And this is actually one of the classic examples where I feel like I have observed people say, well, the IRB approved it, so it must be okay. And that is not true. The IRB is not interested in thinking about the ethics of withholding food aid for a control group, I don't think. I think the IRB is concerned about a lot of other details, which are important, but it doesn't remove that question from us as a researcher in terms of, is withholding from the control group okay? I think to me, the most obvious justification for it is when you're budget constrained, and when an organization is budget constrained, and it's just a matter of selecting participants, which we have to do in one way or another. There's still ethical questions involved. Certainly, we can't just ignore them, but randomization is one way to assign who gets limited resources. Kurt, you mentioned that sometimes another way of like thinking about the ethics is to make sure that the control group gets the access to the program at a later date. I think a lot of researchers actually promise that in grant applications and then don't follow through. I think even organizations might promise that, and then, you know, funding decisions get shifted as priorities shift. And so I'm actually, I haven't seen any data on this, but I'm curious to know how often those promises aren't carried out. And so I think that's another ethical question that we should be thinking about. Yeah, there's certainly questions.
Yeah, I think I'd be interested. I think Mywish asked this question. I'd be interested in what components stand out to you in particular as divergent from some of the health components. In my mind, there are a bunch. And one is what Sarah just said, is the follow-up. I think if you participate in a drug trial or something like that, the expectation is you're going to find out if it worked. And yeah, you may then get that if it did work and it is something that you still need, but you're going to get the results at the very least. And I think that doesn't happen a lot of the time for us. I think one of the other pieces gets back also to that idea of pre-registration. RCTs for health have to be pre-registered or they won't be published. That's like they're all available. So that solves some of this file drawer problem, because if you're testing something, it's online, or it's a government site. So it was for a while. We'll see what happens. And we also don't have that. And so there's a little bit less accountability in terms of what we're actually doing and less tracking of the things that we are doing our CTs about. And I know there's lots of places we can register those plans now, but I don't know how many economists are actually doing it, because pre-registration isn't a requirement for publication of our CTs. Yeah, sorry, Sarah, I stepped on you a little bit there, but I got excited. I think thinking of it from a participant perspective, I think people understand the scarcity concern or the scarcity component, or I think that people understand that. I know that when I've had family participate in a randomized drug trial control, they knew walking in like that they might not get the thing, but the participation was still important. But I think that the failure to follow up also speaks to a failure to engage completely, to complete a program. And I know there are constraints that prevent us from doing so, but that seems like a liftable burden that we could do.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, really good points. Thank you all for that. I'm going to move to a question asked by Dave Shirley, wondering how you think in the context of deductive versus inductive focus on the downside of parking, lock us into a strictly deductive approach and close off an approach to learning, inductive rather than deductive, that recognizes the insufficiency of our conceptual models and that may allow insights that otherwise could not be had. And related to that, in community sustainability, we use a lot of different methods, and grounded theory approach is exactly deriving your questions from the data that you collect, for example. So there's a way to do that. So curious about your thoughts on that, particularly in kind of like.
I can take that one actually, and maybe I'll repeat just a little bit because I think Laura cut out just briefly there. So the question was specifically asking about how you think about harking, this hypothesizing after results are known, and this idea that if we're not allowed to do that, so that's a problem, right? Maybe that's a problem if you're pretending like you had this hypothesis when you didn't, and then you pretend like your results are proving this hypothesis to be true. The flip side of that, though, is that if you're not allowed to do that, I think this is Dave's point, that maybe we're limiting learning. And this, I think, is similar to like my concerns about pre-analysis plans, where if you're not allowed to deviate from your pre-stated analysis plan, then sometimes you are like constrained in such a way that it's limiting learning or limiting kind of the creative process and even the peer review process. So if you think about a simple peer review process, the whole idea is that as you go out and present your research at a conference or in a seminar, and then you submit your paper for publication and people give you feedback, research is expected to be this very iterative process. And you'll learn as you go, and you'll make adjustments based on feedback, based on deep thinking, and it will evolve over time. And that can be true for a theoretical model. So I actually have a really great example of this. In one of the papers that I published, and we actually discuss it in that pre-analysis plan paper with Jeff, I have a paper where we had a pre-analysis plan. We deviated from it. We talked about the deviations in the appendix, but a reviewer actually said, you need a theoretical model. So we said, okay. And we made a theoretical model. We hypothesized after the results were known, and we were a little concerned about putting this in the paper because we didn't want to be accused of harking. And what we did was we put the model at the end of the paper. And we were very purposeful about it. And we even basically said, like, I think we might have a comment in there, thank you to a helpful reviewer. The reviewer's comment made the paper better. The model made the paper better. But we need to be allowed to do that. Now, maybe it's better if we do it in a transparent way. Maybe that affects the way people interpret what we're doing. But I absolutely agree with Dave's point. I think this is Dave's point in the question, that researchers need flexibility. I think it's helpful if we're transparent about why we're making decisions and how our research evolves. But I think we do need the ability to have our research evolve, because that's how we get to the answers, I think. Trade-offs. That's all.
Yeah, I think the transparency part is a big part of it. I teach our graduate seminar course, and so my master's students are like writing their theses, and some of them have like a kind of pre-analysis plan that they're starting with and are concerned about how to express in their thesis these extensions and things like that. And I'm like, well, you write it down. You say that I had this original plan, and then here's the other stuff. I think as economists, we adhere to a very, or speaking as an economist, we adhere to a very tight format of a paper, and deviations from that feel really bad. And I think that like allowing ourselves a little bit of flexibility, because on the scale of things one can do, I think harking is like kind of, I think there's a lot of it that is just part of the process of research, and people wouldn't put a word to it a lot of the time. Yeah, I want to leave space for the creativity while noting it appropriately.
Great. And I am back. Sorry if I blinked out there for a minute. I did warn y'all it might happen. Okay. It looks like MyWish has a follow-up to the RCT question, which is a good point, I think. So this is not restricted to RCT, but applies to all primary data collections that we often include in our grant proposal or consent statement, the potential benefits of doing the research to the farmer and the community. But do researchers actually follow up and share the results of the research with the communities? How many are including funds for community outreach in their budget at the end of the research project? Really good point. Curious your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think that another way to think about that is how many funders are willing to allow that to be an allowable expense at the end of a project. I think that there's back to the comment, we had a conversation earlier about co-creation, and I think that what MyWish brings up is sort of closes the loop on the co-creation. It's like, you don't just need to co-create it, you need to make sure that the people you co-created with fully understand the outcomes and outputs and outcomes of the work. And one of the challenges of that is actually getting donors to allow us to write that into the budget. It's not free. A good job, to really do that right, you would need to go out there and sit down with, stakeholders, local stakeholders, and talk to them about the outputs. They're not going to care about harking. They want to know the outcomes. And I think that is often not sharing dilutes the benefit of the co-creation process. And we need to push back on donors and funders to allow us to do that if we really want to have that loop closed. Over.
I think something else in this, and this isn't really necessarily thinking about our CTs, but is thinking about often the long lag in evaluation that might be happening and the long lag between when an RCT is conducted and when it's like actually done. And I wonder how much that affects the going back component. Like your grant, you have money to go back, but your grant has ended and your research isn't published and you're not done yet, and your grad student's still analyzing the data. And so how much do those functional components also affect actually going back to a community and engaging with them? And how can you meaningfully engage if the work isn't complete? I'm thinking from a personal perspective about evaluating some of the CG work through a SPIA standing panel on impact assessment grant. And there are some programs that were done, but it looks like no one ever evaluated if they worked or if they were even actually disseminated rather than just created. And so even in places where the CGs are really embedded in these communities, some of that just did it work isn't even happening.
All right. So there's one question I'd love to pose to all of you, and it's kind of, we have one participant who kind of posed it too. You all have been touching on some ethical challenges that are partly brought on by the structures in which we're doing this work, right? So you've talked a little bit about the funding structures and the constraints on that in terms of genuine partnership with communities, sharing results back to communities. What about academia? Because academia is placing some structural, challenges for the ways that we engage as well. I'd love to hear you talk about how should academia be reformed so that we can act more ethically? I guess is my question. I have thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours.
I want to hear your thoughts, Laura. That's a
No,
hard
please, you go first.
Oh God. I guess that's such a deep question. Academia as a whole is changing in so many ways, right? Like I have colleagues who started here before I was born, and like the structure of the system that they came into is very different than the structure that I've entered into. And I think a big part of that is we now I'm trying to think of like a nice way to say this. It used to be that the state gave the money and it supported our programs, and now the state gives us no money, and so we have to go out and like hustle. And that has really shifted. I think someone had a comment about incentives. It's shifted our incentives a lot about how we behave and what we do. And I am on a hard money position, so I don't need to fund the work that I'm doing necessarily because there's money for my salary. But that is a really fortunate position in a lot of academia these days. And I think that it shifts the incentives that I take as opposed to colleagues that I have who need to fund every penny of their salary. And I don't think one of us is doing ethical versus unethical work. I can take a slowness that other people can't, I think. I don't know where I'm going, but academia is a real mess, guys, and I think it's going to get worse. So maybe I'll let someone else talk.
I mean, I think the only thing I'll add to that is just that like it's all about the incentives, right? So I'm going to sound a lot like an economist, but our incentives as researchers are to publish, and that distortion, or maybe now we're being more incentivized also to look for funding in certain ways, right? So it's funding and it's publications. And so that just the funding distorts the research questions we ask. So does the publications, right? Like the ability to publish certain types of questions, certain types of methods, where you publish, how quickly you publish, I might be like applauded on the back if I go back and like share my research with a local community, but I'm not really incentivized to do that, right? So, and I think actually those of us in land grant institutions are incentivized to do that in a way that's stronger than other academic departments. At least if I'm thinking about ag econ compared to econ, I think we do have an incentive to do meaningful research and to do research in such a way that it has an impact on communities. So I think that's good, but we're a long ways from perfecting it.
Yeah. I think it's, does the academic structure need to change? Absolutely. I think that the incentive to publish is not the incentive to create, ethical, sustainable economic change in the communities that we work with. And they're different things. And by many academic standards, I'm a terrible academic, but I do a lot of work in the field. And I think that there's a big issue that shaped my work in the field has been the incentives put in place. I'm going back to the donor again, to do that work. And I've had periods where I've been hard funded and had periods where I've been soft funded. And when I have been soft funded and I've had to go out and really hustle to bring in my salary, I was placed in situations where the donor regulations I was forced to do some things that ethically I really didn't like in terms of how I was working with my partners. And I had no choice but to do that in the short term until I could find a long-term solution to the problem. And so the incentives and ethics, so that Venn diagram, when that overlaps, it's big and it's important. And I think that as people who do international development work, who are really focused on, improving livelihoods in the developing world, our incentives and the ethics around our incentives are different than people who do more theoretical work. And it'd be great to see academia give us more space and leeway to do that. So
Yeah, very well said. So we're coming to the end of the hour, but I always like to leave on a positive note or call to action, given the state of the world. So I wonder if each of you could briefly describe something that you're hopeful about, like a positive development in your field in the realm of ethics, or a practice that you think is great that everybody should adopt or should know about. So some reason for hope and positive momentum. Anna, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I'm really optimistic when I talk to my students because they are really, I think, thoughtful about specifically like p hacking in a way that I think people weren't for a long time, and not just from a ethical perspective, but a thinking about not just throwing the kitchen sink at a regression and being done with it, but thinking about the components and not just digging through them. So that makes me optimistic. And also their general horror at people being non-compliant with an IRB, I guess, or that you would say one thing and then do another, left people sort of speechless when we were talking through different examples of that. So maybe I have a particularly good group of students right now, but that leaves me optimistic for how the expectations in the field are changing coming up.
I'll go next. I'm really optimistic about collaboration with non-Western researchers. I think even if there are systems being put in place to like make sure there are I talked about that there's co-PIs or whatever. I think there's a genuine interest from a lot of people in making that collaboration really meaningful. I think thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in this collaborative space, if you're working across different cultures and contexts, is really important. And I'm optimistic that there are enough of us that value that it will change in the years ahead.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about the sort of all this change that we're facing. After we get through this period of flux, which is pretty severe at this point in time, I hope that we are better able to communicate the impact of our work, and the people we work with directly are better understand to take our work and do something with it. My students are all a lot of them are very focused on working in the communities, and a lot of them aren't so much focused on developing theory around the community engagement, but how to use theory to do community engagement and have more impact in the field. I'm hopeful that the next generation of graduates from our programs are not only better skilled in the theory, but they're also better skilled at using the theory to create sustainable solutions in the real world. And that's what I'm hopeful about. They can learn from our mistakes.
Great answers, everyone. Thank you. Appreciate that. And I appreciate the discussion, and really a lot to think about. So I think we're out of time now, so I'm going to turn it over to Ayala to take us out and wrap this up.
Okay, thank you so much. I have so very much enjoyed listening to this conversation, and thank you for allowing us to listen in and also to participate. I hope that everyone who is present today found it rewarding, and also we intend to post the video on the web so that others can also benefit from the conversation that we had today. So this was the first session of a webinar series. We intend for there to be more coming up, so please stay tuned for future conversations on other topics that will be also quite interesting. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day.